Good afternoon, everyone. As Vashti pointed out, Rodney Taylor, Secretary General of the CTU, I'm pleased to lead this discussion on Caribbean harmonization. The CTU itself is a regional organization established since 1989 to harmonize telecommunications policy and regulations. Joining me, of course, is Sofie Maddens, who you just heard from. Excellent presentation. You know, I was riveted to my seat as you spoke about establishing institutions and cutting off their hands. And as I sat there, I thought, that's not the only thing they cut off sometimes, you know. But it is very, very relevant, very much so to the Caribbean. And we face many challenges as we move forward, and I'll give a few examples as we begin. But we're also joined by Kay Seeley, who's the Director of Foreign Trade in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade for the government of Barbados. And also Dr. Chantal Ononaiwu, who is with the Director of Trade in the CARICOM Single Market, for CARICOM Single Market and Trade. One second, let me pull up the bio. Right. In the CARICOM's Secretariat Directorate of the CARICOM Single Market and Trade. I forgot that right. It's based in Barbados, and she leads the Directorate's work pertaining to external trade negotiations and external trade policy. She has served as a senior advisor to the community on matters pertaining to international trade and investment, and she is a negotiator for CARICOM in its external trade negotiations. I should also tell you with respect to Kay Seeley, she is Director of Foreign Trade in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. She's a trained economist and a business administrator, and she's the principal advisor on Barbados' international trade policy. She advocates and defends Barbados' international trade policy interests in different fora at the international, regional, and bilateral level. We're also joined by Mr. David Geary, virtually. I believe he's in Ireland somewhere. David? He has over 20 years experience in telecommunications, utility regulations, antitrust law, and European affairs. He was the General Counsel of Digicel Group, where he worked in the Caribbean and the South Pacific for over a decade. He previously worked with Telco, the incumbent operator in Bahrain, and practiced with major law firms in Brussels and Dublin. David, can we bring David up on screen? Hi, David.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, good. You can hear us. Where are you now?
I'm in somewhere in Ireland. Indeed, I am. In Limerick in Ireland. Sorry, I can't be with you.
Yes, you're missing the wonderful sunshine here in Barbados. We're right at the beachfront resort.
Thanks.
So we're going to. David has a few slides he wants to share with us. I'll just, in opening this session, everything you said, Sofie, resonated with us. In fact, David was part of our negotiations last year to reduce roaming within CARICOM, roaming rates as we move within the CARICOM space. There's an initiative called the CARICOM Single ICT Space, and we're trying to harmonize policy and regulation around telecommunications. Of course, we signed the declaration of St. George's towards the reduction of roaming. We saw roaming charges reduced by as much as 97% on voice data and text messages. And even then, we still believe that we can go further to full elimination so that persons within the CARICOM space can roam as they're at home. The operators pointed out to several challenges to getting there, including the lack of harmonization or disparities, certainly in regulation, telecoms policies as they move even within this space, and the differences in licensing regime, the fees that they pay, and so on. So we also have a responsibility to move our harmonization project further down the road. We're also dealing with another issue that came up, which is the OTT providers and the big tech companies that are competing as well with the operators in the space who are regulated, they are not regulated. And of course, to deal with these challenges, we need to take a harmonized approach within the region. So I'm going to let David start off with his presentation, and then we'll pass over to Kay and then to Chantal to give just a few opening perspectives from where they both sit. David, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Rodney, and hello, everybody. Good morning from Ireland, where it is not quite as sunny, unfortunately, but I'm sorry I can't be with you at this meeting. Just as a question, if I may, Rodney, I see that on the screen I have the front page of my slides appears. Should I share my slides from my computer, or will someone move those slides forward?
We can move them forward for you.
Okay, well, if you could turn to the first slide, so please, that would be great. Thank you. So we've been working and thinking about these issues for many years now. And I suppose when we're talking about effective legal frameworks for building the digital economy in the Caribbean, a good question to start with is, where do we want to go? And I'm reminded of a campaign that the Irish government ran in the 1980s in US newspapers, which essentially, as you can see, was saying we missed the Industrial Revolution. And what it was saying was, we've already made a step change to a tech economy, and we're not encumbered by, legacy regulation and legacy legal frameworks and so on. And in a way, the Caribbean has a similar opportunity. We have a blank canvas to create a new framework for the digital economy in the region. And other regions are in the process of creating regulatory frameworks to work for them. So it's appropriate we think about what are our priorities in the Caribbean, what's important to us. To me, protection of democracy would be very high up the list. And Giuliano Amato, the former Prime Minister of Italy, in his seminal text on antitrust law, wrote that democratic societies must never permit unlegitimate private power to arise. And that may seem obvious, but that is where we are at the moment. There are real threats to our democratic societies in the digital age. And digital companies, many of them already dominate not just the internet, but many aspects of our lives. And we've seen this in the Caribbean. Cambridge Analytica famously used the Caribbean to develop its data micro-targeting tools that it went on to use in the 2016 Brexit referendum in the UK and the US election that year. So they used the Caribbean to experiment with democracy. And in other respects, we will also have other priorities to jurisdictions such as the US and the EU. And as an example, the US will want to see as few overseas rules as possible on its tech companies. But in the Caribbean, we need networks. And it's not clear that investment is coming for 5G and gigabit networks in this region. Caribbean governments will need to raise taxes from digital providers in the digital economy. So our interests aren't the same, they're not always aligned. And it's right that in the Caribbean, we design a framework that works for us. Now, having said that, there are different versions of the internet emerging, and the Caribbean, being a smaller region, should gravitate logically towards one or other of these. And there's different versions, as you can see. One academic has called, describe these as the Beijing paternal internet or the Silicon Valley open internet, and also has a description of the EU internet being a sort of well-ordered, self-regulating, responsible, more or less open internet, informed by legal tradition of balancing freedom and justice and fairness. And the emphasis on fundamental rights and freedoms in the constitutions of the Caribbean states, particularly the CARICOM states, aligns very closely with the approach in Europe. And it seems to me that our legal systems and our constitutional systems align on this issue in terms of digital economy, probably best with some of the norms we're seeing coming from the EU as well. So with that in mind, where do we go to next? And I'm reminded of that joke about the Irish farmer giving directions to the American tourist and saying, well, if you want to go there, you shouldn't be starting from here. And in a way, we have a similar problem in that we have a mix of sectoral rules across jurisdictions, And harmonization, in the region, hasn't been without challenge. Professor Gilbert Morris gave a very frank assessment of progress and thinking about harmonization at Counsel some years ago. I won't repeat his critique, but I've left the link to it there. But essentially, he called us to think afresh and to have a bold vision for the future. If we go to the next slide, please. So with that in mind, I think it's useful also to consider the options that are definitely not on the table. And I think, doing nothing is not on the table. I think everybody agrees on that. And also taking action too slowly, which I'll come back to in a moment, is not an option either. And the risks are simply too great. So we must innovate. We must take action. And if we consider the risks, I mentioned the risks to democracy. In the region, local media is losing advertising revenue to big tech. This was addressed in other jurisdictions, Australia and Europe in particular. And we need to act to protect our free press. The EU is now looking, as Rodney mentioned, to how to fund future networks. And investors are less and less interested in investing in telecoms networks. This is a problem for the Caribbean. Are we going to get 5G networks in the Caribbean this decade? So that's somewhere where action is needed. And then another non-option, if I'd call it, is we can't simply copy what was done somewhere else. And turning to the EU, we can't just simply copy EU rules. Firstly, it won't protect our priorities. And also, it's not practical to think we're going to be able to emulate what they are doing in the EU. We have lessons from previous experience of this, such as competition law, telecommunications regulation itself, the EU approach to net neutrality, which were, in some cases totally inappropriate for the Caribbean, and in other cases, some of the norms were just not practical. So we need to apply our resources wisely in the region. We're never going to have regulators with thousands of staff. So we must choose the elements and the themes that are important for us and find a way to apply these. And also, I think we can't assume that the companies, the bigger tech companies, are going to apply the same standards globally themselves. The so-called Brussels effect, where the norms coming out of Europe become accepted globally. This may not happen, or may not happen quickly. Companies can apply different standards and have different behaviors in different regions. So we already see this in the Caribbean. We know that the tech companies follow EU rules in the French West Indies, and we know that they apply lower standards for the rest of us. Next slide, please. So timely intervention is required. We have to act. And then if we think for a moment about, again, where we are, coming back to the Irish directions, we actually do have a lot of regulatory resources in the region. The problem is the same functions are replicated, across regulators and ministries in each country. We do have constitutions that protect fundamental rights and freedoms, and acting together, the Caribbean is not of an insubstantial size. So we do have a great opportunity, but we can't delay any further. So I think, having looked at this, it seems that the key approach that's going to be important is horizontal economy-wide rules that apply to all service providers across the entire region. I think in terms of sector-specific frameworks, we need to reduce our reliance on those insofar as possible. So the future framework must include consumer law and data protection. And I think these elements are well known. A regulation of market power, obligations on gateway platforms, in particular those that are essential facilities, and enabling competition law to be used proactively. I know there was a discussion on competition law yesterday. Obligations as regards harmful content, and we need new rules on artificial intelligence, and there will be other innovations required. So we are going to need to move to regional centres of excellence and regulators where we can concentrate expertise for the entire region. And then we're going to need to fund these. And there's two models, and I would argue that the model under the GDPR in Europe, where the regulators are funded by general taxation, is the wrong model. And there are other examples. For example, there's a new digital regulator being established in Ireland, and they're going to impose a levy on the industry, on all service providers. That would strike me as the better way for this region to move forward. And the next slide, please. So I'd like to conclude with two thoughts. Firstly, it's going to take time to develop a regional framework, but we don't have time. We can't wait for years. That talk by Gilbert Morris, Professor Morris, was, I think, 6 or 7 years ago at Canto. It's now quite pressing. We can't wait this amount of time. So we need to take interim steps while we're building a framework that for the region that will last in the longer term. And there's some steps that we could take now. We can look at innovations like amending existing ICT laws or other local laws, so that regulators can get information from digital platforms as to what they're doing. And this will inform our decision making as well. We can apply the competition law provisions that we currently have, either in competition frameworks or in sector-specific legislation. And we can, if necessary, amend these to ensure they apply across all sectors, certainly all service providers in the digital sector. And it would also help if these could be enforced directly by individuals privately before the courts, because this will bring a form of market discipline that we're lacking at the moment. And then, an innovation that's come that I mentioned in Australia is obliging tech platforms to engage locally with service providers they rely on. So in Australia, they are obliged to engage with local media to pay them for their content. The EU now is looking at introducing a similar framework to oblige them to engage in terms of payment for infrastructure that they use and funding of future networks. So the second point then I would make in terms of including is, even when we do have a regional framework, it's still going to be difficult. So we need to be innovative here as well. For example, as I said, big tech already applies EU standards and follows EU laws in the French West Indies. So can we get them to voluntarily commit to do the same across the Caribbean region? Can we look at co-regulation type instruments that will deliver that outcome before or even while we have a new framework in place? Can we oblige them to follow child protection principles that they follow elsewhere? And there's a global movement led by the Five Rights Foundation to do just that in Africa, Latin America, I believe California as well. Can we get a commitment to this, that children will be protected? And then can we develop systems that enable Caribbean regulators and courts to use evidence and findings, that are coming out and will be coming out of jurisdictions such as the EU directly for similar investigations here, copycat investigations? So can we think innovatively about new partnerships, new forms of partnership? It's not just about funding for capacity building, which is important, but a deeper sort of engagement where we can benefit directly from work that's being done in jurisdictions where there are more resources. So I think that's the next slide, please. So I think I'll leave it there. I have some reference points on that slide, but looking forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you very much, David. And we will make the presentations available on our site, at the CTU website. So thank you. I have a question, but I'm going to leave it to the end in the interest of time, because I wanted to ask about ECTEL and whether that was a useful model for us to build on, of course, applicable to the Eastern Caribbean states, but whether or not there were some good, and I see my friend Apollo here might be able to speak to that as well later on. But I'm going to move over to Kay Seeley, Director of Trade, and of course, David presented primarily from a telecommunications perspective, or ICT perspective, I should say. But there are broader issues, of course, with respect to trade and the need for harmonization of regulations to promote digital trade and to develop digital economies, as was evident in Sofie's presentation. So why is harmonization and regulation important for us here for regional integration?
And good morning, everyone. I also wear another hat, so I'm actually the Commonwealth Cluster Lead on Regulatory Connectivity. So as it relates to harmonization, imagine it, extend your rationale at the national level to the regional level. And it is as simple as that. At the regional level, we need to ensure that there's proper functioning and implementation of whatever arrangement we're in. Now there's CARICOM, there's the OECS, there's the Association of Caribbean States, there's CARIFORM, which brings together CARICOM and the Dominican Republic. We have the EPA, which brings us together with the EU territories in the region. So there are numerous integration movements here in CARICOM. And by the way, does anyone know how many years CARICOM is celebrating this year? It's a big year for us. Nobody from the institutions can answer. 50. Thank you very much. Now, we harmonize because we're looking at trade in goods, services, movement of people, movement of capital. We're looking at coordination of policy. So we have CTU here. There was just mention of centers of excellence. We have CCC here. CrossQ was here this morning, OTN is here. And there's a reason why we have all these institutions. They are centers of excellence, of course, and we need them because we don't all have the capacity. We need to make sure we're all speaking from the same sheet. You know, we have a number of similarities, but there are a number of differences as well. So the extent to which we can harmonize to make it more predictable, more transparent, efficient, and of course, we're building trust. You can imagine what it is for a business person to be here in Barbados trying to figure out what is the system in Trinidad and Tobago, what's the system in Jamaica. You know, we need to be able to say with a certain amount of certainty, okay, we're all part of a particular movement. This is what obtains in Barbados. This is what obtains outside. Now, the EU might be a little different. I know the EU has a minimum harmonization type arrangement whereby they prescribe a minimum, and that is your floor in essence. You could go above. So we're trying to create a similar environment in the Caribbean whereby you know with certainty, once that is there, that is what maintains. So in a nutshell, that is why we need to harmonize. We need predictability, and in the Caribbean, we're not doing it for the governments. It's something we keep on knocking to our stakeholders. We create these arrangements for businesses, for people, you know, especially our children and for generations to come. So that is my introduction to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. And Chantal, from where you sit, of course, you're in a similar capacity, but your mandate goes beyond promoting intra-CARICOM trade, but more as well, including how we can trade with the rest of the world. So what are some of the challenges that you encounter, and can you share your perspective on this issue of harmonization?
Okay, thank you. And let me just thank the Commonwealth Secretariat and the CTU for inviting the Secretariat to share perspectives on this issue. I want to just take a step back and return to the CARICOM Single Market and Economy initiative, of which even pursuit of a common external trade policy forms a part. And I wanted to just recall that dating back to 2017, the Conference of Heads of Government of CARICOM, the highest decision-making body in CARICOM, had actually approved a vision and a roadmap for creating a single CARICOM ICT space. Rodney would have mentioned this in his opening remarks. And the concept of a single ICT space is consistent with the creation of a single market, but a single market operating in a digital environment. And so the vision is really an ICT-enabled borderless space. Now, you can imagine if that's the vision, a key characteristic of a single CARICOM ICT space would be a unified or harmonized or at least common regulatory framework. And so an important characteristic of this ICT space is regionally harmonized ICT policies, legislation, and also regulatory regimes. Now, I was really interested in our previous speaker speaking to the possibility of amendment, because sometimes that's what's required to achieve harmonization, not necessarily waiting on the introduction of legislation de novo, but just amending existing legislation, amending existing frameworks. And that's contemplated as part of the harmonization project as well. As Kay would have mentioned, harmonization is imperative because it's critical for easing the cost of doing business within the region. And I don't know if I could do it now or maybe a bit later, but just a flag, and it dovetails with our earlier presentation on the HIPCAR project. Harmonization of this regulatory framework cuts across quite a number of issues. Data protection, intellectual property regimes, e-commerce, bearing in mind that we have had a long-standing commitment within the community to develop a protocol on electronic commerce. And I can see that there would have been earlier discussion of competition policy, as well as telecoms regulation. But I also just wanted to recall that in the revised treaty that governs and underpins the single market arrangement, harmonization of laws and administrative practices is actually contemplated generally as something that needs to support the establishment of a single market. And I just want to round off by recalling, and I think Sofie would have mentioned this as well, that there has been recognition that the imperative of recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, it really provides us with a unique opportunity to fast track digital transformation. That has been recognized at the highest level. It was recognized in the CARICOM Commission on the Economy report dating back to 2020 in the throes of the pandemic, that we had to move towards a digital economy as with alacrity. It's also been recognized by the region's trade ministers in February of last year. They approved plans and priorities for the next couple of years up to 2024. It's not too far away, 2024 is next year, which includes a digital transformation fast tracking plan. And again, I just want to stress that it is recognized that achieving compatibility, achieving coherence, achieving harmonization of the underlying regulatory and legislative framework is seen as important. Just to round off, Rodney, you specifically asked me about the external front. I just want to underscore something that Sofie said, which is that what we're trying to do at the intra-regional level, of course, has to coexist with developments that are taking place globally. These developments relate to increasingly addressing issues relating to digital trade, for instance, in preferential trade agreements. Kay would have mentioned the CARIFORUM EU Economic Partnership Agreement, which in a limited way touches on electronic commerce, but modern and deep trade agreements are going significantly further in addressing issues pertaining to digital trade. And even at the multilateral level, all CARICOM members except the Bahamas and Montserrat are members of the WTO. There are discussions taking place multilaterally on electronic commerce, and even a subset of WTO members, I think 87 if I last kept track, are actually seeking to go further in a plurilateral initiative to establish what they're calling high level or high ambition rules to address trade related aspects of e-commerce. So just situating the need for these efforts at harmonization to take stock of not just what countries may want to achieve at the national level, what goals they set at the regional level, but also what's taking place globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So I think we are unanimous in our view that harmonization is very important. Yeah. So the challenges, though, with that, I mean, I referenced the fact, the institutions and the funding, for example, and it for me is a measure of the commitment of the region to harmonization with respect to the commitment to the institutions that it has established to drive this harmonization. And I can point to, I mean, like, for example, the single ICT space, the roadmap, and we can look at funding for that. Where's the funding to actually make it happen? Sofie, you worked with the HIPCAR project. What are some of the how successful was it really? And what are some of the challenges with respect to trying to, whether they're the lack of political will or the silos when you come to the sovereign states and, you know, the turf wars that we have even within this small space. Speaking very frankly, what are some of the challenges that we have?
I'm looking at my colleague Cleveland. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about the various harmonization projects that we did, right? So not just to point a finger at the Caribbean, I also have the experience of doing the UEMOA, ECOWAS, COMESA, also harmonization South Saharan Africa. There are always challenges because you always have issues of national sovereignty. You have issues of administrative capacities. You have administrative history. I mean, if I think of the project we did in Western Africa, where we tried to bring together the Anglophone with the Francophone and the Lusophone countries, you had very different legal traditions there. So how do you find the common denominator to harmonize? And having started my career in the European Commission, working on the OMP directive, the mobile green paper, the satellite green paper, the audiovisual green paper, and the whole series of harmonization and liberalization that took place in Europe. So I think one point I want to make is when you're looking at harmonization, when you're looking at these projects, really do start with an assessment. Really analyze the data points. Where are the gaps? What needs to be fixed? And again, that comes to the point that David made and that Chantal made as well. You don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes you have basic texts that are already in place and that just need to be adapted. So start with that assessment. And I think that was one of the core success factors of HIPCAR is that we started with that assessment. I think the second point is get all the stakeholders around the table. Now, one of the key success factors of the UEMOA and of HIPCAR as well is that we didn't just bring in the telecoms regulators. We brought a whole series of stakeholders. It's not just about capacity building, it's about listening. And again, that comes to that data, right? It's about listening. It's about understanding the concerns. I look at David. We've had a lot of discussions between OTTs versus incumbents, right, David? Including in the Bahamas, right, David? So bring in all the different aspects to understand the concerns, understand the economic concerns. It's about the bottom line. And as you said, it's about, I think at the end of the day, it's about the people. Let's keep in mind that it's about the people. And also, again, it comes to funding. These projects take a lot of work and a lot of money. It takes a lot of money to take it further, to not just have a consultant come in for 3 weeks and then have all the paper put in the drawers and forgotten about. So you really need that sustainability. You need these sustainable efforts to come to that harmonization. And for that, again, I come to bring all the stakeholders around the table, because when you're talking about these regional harmonization initiatives, bring in your trade people, bring in your regional organization people, have those discussions with them, and digital cuts across the sectors. I'm really pleased to see that the Attorney General opened these sessions, Bring in the judiciary, because they need to implement these texts. They need to understand them. So it's really about being comprehensive. It's really about being data-oriented, so evidence-oriented, and it's really about being inclusive. Those are just some thoughts.
Thank you very much. David, I asked the initial question about ECTEL. Is ECTEL the shining example for us here in the region? We understand there's a closer political union even within the OECS, and they have more harmonized structures. The Eastern Caribbean Telecoms Authority I'm referring to. What are your thoughts on that as a model, and how has that worked?
Thank you, Rodney. Well, I first have to declare I'm a St. Lucian citizen myself. So anyway, I've worked as well as having a close affinity to ECTEL and St. Lucia. We've worked together, of course, on very many projects over the years. I mean, I suppose, you know, at a high level, yes. I mean, it is the OECS in particular is and ECTEL in the field of telecoms. You know, they are the shining examples of success in terms of a degree of harmonization on various themes in the region. And I mean, a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, firstly, you know, often harmonization is compared to the European example. There was a huge driver for integration and harmonization in Europe post 1945, because, you know, and it was, you know, because of the disaster that we managed to visit on ourselves in Europe, that there was you know, the political objection to integration was removed, and everyone recognized that we need to do something in a new way. I think that's often missing, that component, thankfully, because you hopefully don't have to go to that place to decide cooperation is better. But, you know, that element is often missing around the world at other regional efforts at integration. I mean, there has been a success in the Caribbean, in as you said, in the OECS and ECTEL. But I think if you look then at some of the more recent examples, you know, I think we have to question whether we could do it better. And like the EC, or the Electronic Communications Act in the ECTEL region, which was, you know, the reform of the Telecoms Act that was introduced in 2000. So in around 2010, it was decided to update this legislation. That has taken years. It still isn't enacted in all the ECTEL states, you know, it's 2023. So there's a process question there. Why not? You know, so that's coming back to my point about what happened to Europe, but that's often about drive and structure. You know, how do you make this integration happen? How do you you know, have a process that makes it go forward? In Europe, they develop those processes. So do we need to look at that? And the second point I'd make about that EC Act, if I may, is, and I think, you know, I think everybody in the process is well aware of the difficulties we had. But one of the problems was that, you know, it was sort of, it wasn't as future looking as it might have been for various reasons. Coming back to Gilbert Morris's point about, you know, how policy is shaped in the region, it didn't really look to, you know, what is the economy going to look like in 10 or 15 years' time. It was more about fixing legislation that already existed. So that probably was the wrong approach. And the second point was that a lot of the discussion was informed by consultants who were coming in internationally with their experience of what worked in Europe and what worked in other places. But this was wholly inappropriate for the Caribbean. It wasn't realistic to expect that solutions that worked, you know, the European Commission or with its network of regulators in Europe of, you know, whatever it is, probably 10,000 people, staff, you know, what they can do there or what we can do in the Caribbean are vastly different. So it wasn't, you know, coming back to the point I made earlier, I think we need to look at norms that we think are good and say, okay, we'd like to follow them, but we have to make them digestible in our region. I think that was part of the problem as to why it took so long for the legislation to pass, because there really wasn't that level of cohesiveness as to what we're trying to do. So there's lessons, I think, from ECTEL that are very valuable.
Thank you, David. I want to open for questions, but just before we do that, I'll just pass back over to Kay and Chantal. With respect to the focus on harmonization within the region, a lot of, well, it's certainly in the case of data protection legislation, a lot of it was driven by the GDPR, the EU's move to implement the general data protection regulations. To what extent are these external factors more, I guess, more of a driving force than our own regional imperatives, right? The markets outside are much bigger. Are our governments really that concerned so much about intra-CARICOM trade as opposed to trading with external partners? And is that sort of the motivation or a demotivation for driving harmonization regionally?
If I can probably take a stab at it, just to say that as you're getting to the point, regional integration is not static. So you may find in some movements you may be reactive as opposed to proactive. There are real capacity constraints, and as you would in the real world, yes, it would be wonderful if you can be 10 steps ahead, and we could put all these things in place in a timely manner to make us blend in, and integrate into the world economy a lot easier than it probably is right now. But I find sometimes, yes, external forces drive a lot of the changes in CARICOM, and honestly, COVID has been, I don't want to say it's a blessing, but never lose, as the Prime Minister Barbados says, never lose a good crisis to make the necessary changes that you need to put in place. So yes, regional integration is there to create the best terms and conditions and benefits for your own market. So you would love to maximize the level of intra-regional trade, of course, but you're mindful that you can't just trade within yourself. You need to trade externally as well. In the EU, I think intra-regional trade accounts for about 70% of all trade, all goods produced in the EU, close to about 70% consumed within the EU. That is not the case in CARICOM. I think last check, probably less than 20%, and we need to up those numbers. So even though you need to strike the balance, each one is important. You build on your synergies within CARICOM, build on your capacities. That is supposed to be your easiest market, should be your easiest market to penetrate. But we have high levels of imports from outside. We need foreign currency, US currency, EU currencies, but it is driven from inside and outside. And we cannot ignore the external forces, the external developments, and we need to react as quickly as possible. In a nutshell, if we can preempt them, not preempt, but predict and do what we need to do beforehand, that would be wonderful. But we're small, and even within our states, we all have different levels of size and development. So we need to moderate expectations.
Thank you. Chantal?
Really agree with everything that Kay said, and it goes back to the point that I made that even when you are seeking to fashion an initiative intra-regionally, you can't be ignorant of global developments. The global developments may pertain to an important trading partner like the EU or the US, but as I mentioned before, there are global developments that may not be unique to one trading partner, in which we may not be participating, but which will set the standards according to which we have to meet as well. But I just wanted to register a point about trying to achieve coherence or harmonization. I think that the chances of doing so are significantly higher if what you are trying to fashion at the regional level is consistent with national priorities. If the two are at odds, you're just not going to have the attention, or you're not going to have the traction with the initiatives. And this is why digital transformation is different than I think some other attempts at fashioning harmonization, because it is a national priority for many of us. Many of us recognize that supplying services or trading over digital networks allows us to transcend constraints of small size. It allows us to achieve economies of scale that we might otherwise not be able to achieve. That is something that unifies all of us, even the larger ones, because it's all relative. So I think that this is an important space where we have to be very strategic in what we set as our targets at the regional level, and we should be aiming at the regional level to fashion initiatives that are consistent with national priorities. I just also wanted to quickly underscore the importance of consultations to this process. Regional initiatives are fashioned on the basis of national positions being developed. Those national positions are robust if they're underpinned by wide-ranging consultations. Sometimes the strength of what you're able to fashion at the regional level is a function of how strong or weak the national consultative process is. And so sometimes if there is sign off on something at the regional level for which there has not been buy-in secured at the national level, you can have on paper agreement by a community organ to something, but the rubber is going to hit the road when it comes to implementation. So I really just want to underscore that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I won't push that any further, but certainly even on the issue of single ICT space, and really the question was whether once a decision is made by the CARICOM heads when they meet, can we take it for granted that that national consultation has taken place? Everybody knows we're on the same page, we're ready to run.
Right, so the quick response, Rodney, is no, and so improving that consultative process is a high agenda issue for the region. It's actually a responsibility of one of our most senior organs, the Community Council, consistently looking at the system of consultations and seeing how it can be improved. And just to recall, the governance framework that we have in CARICOM, the governance framework which is agreed, is one where decisions do not become automatically implemented just because they're taken. Our governance framework is one which is dependent on member states taking actions at the national level to implement the decisions. And when you're talking about legislative changes, you're contending also with what's high on the legislative priorities of the individual member state, which is why I'm reiterating the importance of efforts at harmonization at the regional level being successful when they happen to coincide with what is a priority at the national level as well.
Thank you for that. Vashti, do we have any questions online? Do we have any questions in the room?
Yes, please, Chair. We do have a question online. Before we go out to the room, I see some hands raised. We have a question from Doricia Wilkinson, and this question is for the panel itself. Multiple people here, rightly so, highlighted the need for harmonization. Are there steps in place to actively work towards this? I'm just curious if the wheel is already rolling on this to get a sense of how far away from achieving this is it possible as a region? Thank you.
So, sounds like it was kind of directed at me too. We're not where we need to be, and I just want to, in terms of actually realizing harmonization, but I do want to stress this. One, going back to something Sofie said, it's a bit behind schedule, but importantly, a gap analysis is high on the agenda with respect to the advancing the single ICT space. That is something that has been commissioned. Secondly, I want to just speak a little bit to the framework that we have in place in the region to facilitate efforts at harmonization. As I said, we do have ministerial organs that take policy decisions. So whether it's a ministerial council like the one responsible for trade and economic development, or it's the finance ministers, which in this space may have remit over some of the issues as well, they can approve the regional policy. But we have a legal affairs committee on which ministers with responsibility for legal affairs or attorney generals sit. And that's actually the body which is charged under the treaty with facilitating harmonization, for instance, by approving model legislation. But again, I want to stress that there are multiple ways to achieve. Sometimes I am reticent to use the term harmonization because it makes people think that everything has to be identical, but at least convergence or compatibility or coherence. There are various tools that can be used to do that, which don't necessarily, as I said, require everyone to adopt de novo legislation on a particular issue. But if there are sufficient commonalities in the regulatory framework, it can facilitate cross-border transactions with greater ease. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Kay.
Just to add on a practical point, there are some digital platforms which already are in place in CARICOM. There is SIMSUPRO, which is the CARICOM Integrated Marketplace and Suspension Procedure. There are also public procurement portals, which every single member state in CARICOM is supposed to have. There's also the CARICOM Single Market Application Processing System. So there are some steps which have been taken to put the region in a good place as it relates to digital platforms which can help to promote trade and investment. So things are happening in different places in CARICOM, but they all redound to the big picture to get a digital economy in place.
Thank you.
Rodney?
Should we open to the room?
Rodney, could I? Sorry.
I see, if I can just start with Chris and go around the room. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi there, Chris Southworth from the International Chamber of Commerce. Just a question for Chantal. I mean, from a digital trade perspective, I don't think the EU is leading at all. They're no further ahead than the Caribbean, actually, in terms of modern trade agreements. There are two trade agreements, actually, that come within this network, which is really interesting, I think, that could be applied in the Caribbean, actually could be applied worldwide, from my perspective. There's the deeper agreement in the East between Singapore, Chile, New Zealand. It's not the best agreement in the world, but the modularity of it is interesting, and whether you could do that, and you can allow countries to bolt in and allow to get started. I'm interested in your views on that. And then the gold standard now for me is the UK-Singapore DEA, Digital Economy Agreement, because it allows for a lot of flexibility. It's underpinned by MOUs. It ticks all the boxes that we've been discussing over the last sort of 24 hours. And most importantly, in terms of from a commercial point of view, it's all about alignment and interoperability. And I just wonder whether you think there's scope there, a sort of somehow maybe a modular DEA style agreement across the region could be interesting as a way forward.
Yes, very interesting question. And I'm going to answer you by returning to the commitment that I referenced before. It's not specifically about the digital economy, but it's related. There is, as I said, long-standing commitment in the revised treaty to conclude protocol on e-commerce. Of course, the region isn't locked into only addressing the subject of e-commerce. The region could use the opportunity of addressing that issue and its ambition of achieving a single ICT space to go broader and address digital economy issues if it wishes. And I do think that these digital economy partnership agreements are useful models or references. Actually, my view is that in fashioning intra-regional rules, we should always be cognizant of international best practice, not to copy and paste it, but just to be able to understand if there are elements that would work well in our space. As a matter of fact, more broadly speaking, with respect to the pursuit of our external trade policy, we're reckoning with the reality of declining trade performance generally. And we have to assess what kind of strategies we want to pursue to improve the region's external trade performance and trade performance generally. And there's no getting around the fact that to improve your trade performance in the current environment, that partly has to involve how you adapt to digital technologies, how you integrate digital technologies, and how you adapt to a rapidly changing technological change, how you adapt to rapid technological changes. And I think as part of that assessment of how we improve our external trade performance or trade performance generally, we're going to have to think about whether the traditional trade agreement, which is just focused on liberalizing tariffs, is really the way for us to go, or whether we need to be looking at different forms of cooperation, which may be not just about securing market access, but it may be about supply chain resilience, it may be about digital economy related issues. And that's why I think looking at these models is something, we're already doing it, and it's something that I think we need to do more of.
Thank you. Next question, in the interest of time. Yes. Over here, red dress. Sorry. Can you say your name, please?
Sorry, Finidi Williams, CARICOM intern.
Okay.
Okay, so given the disparity with respect to the varying levels of development coming out of the member islands, how then will harmonization be achieved, and what does the success of harmonization look like with respect to that?
That's a very good question. And one of the points I was making was that of moderation of expectations. And as Sofie said, you need to know where each member state is coming from. So until you have that assessment done, that would inform where you can pitch your level of ambition. In the Caribbean, as it relates to decision making, there are two different types. In essence, there is one where you're looking at the lowest common denominator, and there's one where you're looking at the highest, the goal, and it's where you can pitch your expectations along that spectrum. Now, the discussion we had this morning about small businesses, I asked about micro and how you convince. You need to be able to convince member states that this is good for you. This will benefit you. And unless you can show from the get-go that this will impact you in a positive manner, it is very, very challenging to achieve harmonization at a level which will really redound to the benefit of all participants. So decision-making, where you position yourself, having that appropriate assessment done at the beginning, and also you need to factor in the whole issue of regulatory impact assessments. So from the get-go, you need to be able to show in 2 years' time, in 6 months' time, this is what we're going to do to assess whether or not this is working. So these are the things that we need to do to convince member states to move in certain directions in order to achieve harmonization.
And Sofie, quickly as well.
And
then we'll take the other
that
question.
impact assessment, I think what's important as well is you need to show, because at the end of the day, you need champions to enable the harmonization, because you need the adoption, the implementation, and the enforcement. And I think to win those champions, you need the numbers. You need to look at the economic impact of these decisions. And that information is out there. In ITU, we've done a series of regional studies of the economic impact of broadband digitalization and ICT regulation. This harmonization has an impact, and that, again, your politicians need to know that.
Thank you. Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the panel discussion and for allowing me. Just in the interest of time, practically for us in the region, I would like to propose, I think that us within the region, may it be the law reform commissions, may it be the CPC departments, I think the conversation can happen between ourselves, among ourselves. I think that all that was proposed to us is sound and correct, but we can have discussions among each other. So take, for instance, when we were doing decriminalization of marijuana in Trinidad and Tobago, what we did with our Law Reform Commission, together with our CPC department, is start building a matrix of what everyone's legislation looked like. And we went throughout the Caribbean, and we went throughout CARICOM. And then we started calling each other. Our former Attorney General, Faris Alwari, was on the phone with Guyana, on the phone with St. Vincent, on the phone with, and we were building out our policy and legislation together by just conversing. I also think that human capacity and resources are needed, because the last time I was here, I think the Honorable Attorney General of St. Vincent was here under the RSS at a different time. And we were speaking about, I can't remember, I think it was something in corruption. And Dominica said to me, the representative there, we don't have our legislation online. And I said, what? That was very strange to me. And it was because of human capacity, lack of it, and resources. And I think that if we're able to build that in each country, that's where we need the political willpower. But then when we also have the conversation between ourselves as to what is happening in your country, what is the political will there, what does your policy look like? And of course, policy informs the legislation, then we're going to be on the same page with each other. So I think practically for us as professionals, technocrats, I think that conversation, together with all that CARICOM shares, I think also a good example is what I raised yesterday with Chris, where CARICOM is on the same page with this UN Convention on Cybercrime, we'll call it that for now, because we're all talking to each other, our 14 member states. I did my homework last night, and I sent in my comments, right? So that goes off to the other member states, and then they're going to add theirs. So we're going to have one voice on the table, and that, I think that will help us a lot right here in these types of sessions. Thank you.
So that's an excellent summary. We don't have time, unfortunately, for closing remarks. So that was an excellent summation. And I want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you, David, Sofie, Kay, and Chantal for your contribution today. We've taken copious notes, and I look forward to coming out with some steps